When we were starting out this unit on evolution, one of the first things we looked at was how similar we all are, especially compared to the trees outside of our classroom. We learned that we share about 25% of our DNA with any given tree that we can see from our classroom windows. One of the things that we were hoping to draw from this was that all living creatures are related to one another based on their evolutionary path. Another piece of this, or another part of the evidence for this, is that all things are created from cells, and everything is made up of at least one cell. Within our body, you've got trillions of cells, and every living creature is made up of at least one, right? The smallest being a single cell organism like a bacteria, to then multicellular creatures like you and me, who have trillions and trillions of cells. Our bodies work and function based on the organs that we have in them, right? We've got a brain that tells the rest of the body what to do. We have a heart that pumps blood to all of our extremities. We've got lungs that take in oxygen and get that oxygen into our bloodstream. We've got different organs in our, like our stomach, organs that help us digest food, and our liver to help filter things. All of our different organs work together to carry out very important functions so that we can live our lives and do the things that we like to do. Our cells are no different. So soon, we're going to be looking at cells underneath the microscope. You might have already started this. And as we're looking at those cells under the microscope, whether they're plant cells or animal or bacterial cells, we're going to be looking for their shared similar structures and to see what different types of organelles we can find. So while the human body and every multicellular creature has organs, when we're looking at the cellular level, we call them organelles. Essentially, they are miniature organs within a cell that carry out similar tasks to our big organs. So a cell, we know, is the basic unit of life. It's the structure that holds all of the mini organs or the organelles necessary for life. For life. There we go. How about that? That makes more sense. So within, whether it's a single cell organism or a multicellular organism made up of many, many cells, every cell has little miniature organs called organelles that carry out specific tasks. And that's what it says right here. A function is a task, a specific job, just in case you weren't sure what function was. So when we're looking at the different parts of a cell, one of the most important parts is the outside of it. Just like your skin, cells basically have a skin that goes around the outside, and that is called a cell membrane. Obviously, this is a very complex picture pointing out different types of things here: hydrophilic and hydrophobic sides, cholesterols. There's all sorts of different things here, but what we need to know is that our cells have essentially a skin that we call a cell membrane that holds everything inside. So the cell membrane is the barrier that encloses everything inside. It controls what comes in and out of the cell. If you want to fill in the extension section, you'll write about how cell membranes are made up of a phospholipid bilayer, two layers of fats that allow materials to pass through and others to not pass through. Similarly, plants have a cell wall. Animal cells do not have a cell wall. The reason for this is essentially because animals have bones, right? And we have additional things, additional structures in place that give us some rigidity. Whereas plants, they get that rigidity, they get that tough protective ability to stand tall from their cell walls. So they're tough protective barriers that are found only in plant cells. So it's a thicker layer that is in addition to cell membranes, but only in plants. The chloroplast is one of the most important structures around. The chloroplast is what contains chlorophyll. These here are little discs that are basically just full of chlorophyll and help plants do photosynthesis. So the most important part of the chloroplast is that it does photosynthesis. If you want to fill in the extension section, you can write about how photosynthesis is where the chloroplasts contain chlorophyll. They absorb sunlight and convert that energy into glucose, also known as sugar. Plants then store that sugar and they use it for growth and for reproduction, basically to make themselves bigger and to make more of themselves. Animals do not have chloroplasts, otherwise we would be able to do photosynthesis, which would be pretty cool, but that is why plants are so important to us. They produce oxygen. They don't produce it for us, they produce it for themselves so that they can use that oxygen. But without plants producing extra oxygen, there would be no animal life. The mitochondria, on the other hand, the mitochondria, you might have heard, is the powerhouse of the cell. What does that mean? It produces energy. It creates energy by taking oxygen and sugar and basically setting that sugar on fire. When it does that, it converts sugar into something called ATP, adenotriphosphate. So this would go in the extension section, where the mitochondria is the place where cellular respiration happens, where sugar, glucose, is broken down into ATP, or the cellular version of energy. Essentially, sugar is a really big molecule. It'd be like carrying around $1,000 bill. Kind of useless if you go into a convenience store. Nobody's going to want to give you change for that $1,000 bill. What the mitochondria is able to do is take that $1,000 bill and produce change. It can give you ones or fives, tens, 20s, actually usable denominations of money. That's what ATP is. It's a form of energy that the cell can actually use because glucose is just too darn big. So the mitochondria is the powerhouse because it creates energy through a process called cellular respiration. This is found in both plants and animals because both plants and animals need to produce energy so that they can grow and move and do all sorts of stuff. The nucleus is another organelle found in all plants and animals. The nucleus has many different little parts there, but what we need to know is that it contains DNA, and it is therefore the control center or the brain of the cell. If you're filling in the extension section, the nucleus contains DNA, which is made up of chromosomes. Every organism has a specific number of pairs of chromosomes, which are passed down from the parent organisms. So we have 46 chromosomes as humans. Other organisms have a different number of chromosomes, which means they have a different total amount of DNA. The nucleus is the place where all that DNA is stored. A vacuole is basically an area full of fluid within the cell. It helps maintain pressure inside the cell, and it's a place to store water or waste. The endoplasmic reticulum, with all these little folds here, is right outside of the nucleus. That purple thing has been sliced in half. And the endoplasmic reticulum, its job is to move proteins throughout the cell. If you're filling out the extension, it's located around the nucleus because the nucleus contains the code that decides which proteins are made. And so as the nucleus decides which proteins are made, as those proteins are then made, they need to be moved around by the endoplasmic reticulum. This is essentially kind of like your arteries, right? That help move things all around your body, that help move oxygen around your body. But instead of oxygen, it's proteins. And instead of your arteries, it's the endoplasmic reticulum. Kind of. Ribosomes, these little tiny dots that are on the outside of the endoplasmic reticulum and on the outside of the nucleus, that's where proteins are made. Right? So what we see is that right outside of the nucleus, right, and see those little dots on the nucleus there? Switch there so it's a little bit bigger. Right outside of the nucleus, there's those little dots. Those are ribosomes. There's little dots on the outside of the endoplasmic reticulum. So all three of these things, the nucleus, which controls which proteins are made, the ribosomes, which make the protein, and the endoplasmic reticulum, which moves the proteins around, they're all located right in the same spot, basically to make it easier to build and then move those proteins. So ribosomes create proteins. And as you've learned about in health class, proteins are amino acids linked together to form those proteins. We also compared amino acid chains when you were doing the evidence of evolution packet, and you were looking at those stations and comparing just how similar different organisms were based on their DNA. The way that you do that is you look at their amino acids, which is basically just a computer code that codes for different organisms and how they are built. The Golgi body, or the Golgi apparatus, two different words for the same thing. It prepares, modifies, and sorts the proteins from the endoplasmic reticulum. So basically, it doesn't actually transport them, but it sorts them. So rather than being the mail carrier, that's the post office that's figuring out what to do with all of those ribosomes, or all those proteins. The cytoplasm, that's just all the fluid inside of the cell, right? If this is the cell membrane, here's the nucleus. I think that's supposed to be the endoplasmic reticulum because there's the ribosomes. All the liquid floating around, so kind of like your blood-ish, all the liquid floating around would be the cytoplasm. It's a gel-like fluid. It's where all the chemical reactions happen inside of a cell. It holds all the organisms. You know how you're made up of 80% water? This is why. Because your cells are mostly cytoplasm, which is basically water, right? So the reason why you are 80% water is because your cells are 80% water. It's not because you have just a giant store of water in your stomach or something like that. So single-celled organisms will look a little bit different, right? Single-celled organisms, because they are made up of just one cell, that's the whole organism, so like a bacteria, will often have slightly different structures. The main one is that they've got something called a flagellum or cilia, which cilia are like little hairs, and flagellum is a tail. Whether it's cilia or flagellum, basically it's a way for that bacteria to move around, right? Our cells in our body generally don't need to move around unless they're blood cells, right, which get pumped by our heart. Everything else kind of stays put. You don't want your muscle cells moving. You want them to stay in your arm or in your leg. On the other hand, bacteria need to be able to move. And so they have a flagellum or cilia to help them do that. We're not going to worry specifically about all the differences, but I wanted to show you what a single-celled organism like a bacteria, a drawing, what it looks like. The main difference is that it's got some kind of tail or little hairs that help it move. They also have a nucleoid instead of a nucleus, slightly different way of storing the DNA, but overall the same basic structure as multicellular organisms. When we are looking, am I going to be able to flip back here? Nope. An animal cell, right? We can go through and you can look at all of the different organelles and where they are located here, right? Here's your endoplasmic reticulum right outside of the nucleus, right? Here's your Golgi body. You've got a vacuole for storage over here. Most of the cell is that cytoplasm. And there's lots of other things that we haven't talked about. Don't worry about those. An animal cell and a plant cell look very similar. They changed the color to make it look a little bit different, and they added this green structure around it, which is the cell wall, to make it more structured and less fluid, right? Plant cells are generally a little bit more square or rectangular. Animal cells can be different shapes based on what type of cell they are, and we will see that under the microscope. So, in conclusion, we went pretty quickly here through all the different organelles because we were just getting a basic introduction to the general function of what those organelles do. How those organelles function just like our organs do. They carry out specific tasks within our body, or in the case of an organelle, inside of our cells. Plants and animals share almost all of the organelles, except for, in general, the cell wall and, let me flip, and the chloroplast, which we see right here. You can see the little discs. So apart from that, plant cells and animal cells are very, very similar, as well as unicellular bacteria, because it's another piece of evidence that everything on Earth is related and comes from a common ancestor, because everything shares cells. Every single organism is made up of at least one cell. So let's go off and look at some cells under the microscopes.